Now, with unemployment remaining a major challenge across Africa, we turn our focus on how the African Development Bank can play a crucial role in addressing this issue. Well, this morning I'm joined in the studio by Dr. Samuel Maibo. He's a candidate for the African Development Bank presidency to discuss his vision and aspirations for the organization. Having arrived in the country just yesterday, he has already met with the President, John Dramani Mahama, and engaged with business community. And thank you so much for your time here on Newsdesk.
Thank you very much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here in Accra.
Oh, great. Welcome. Now, we'll delve deeper into the AfDB and the vision you have for the organization. But then let's deal with unemployment, a big issue in West Africa, in Africa to be precise. How do you propose that as a country we can deal with this?
Well, first of all, I want to stress that my candidacy for the African Development Bank is to deal with the fundamental problem that goes to the question that you've asked. Africa is growing. There's so much activity and vibrancy, and you see it around in Accra. The challenge we have is that we're not growing at a pace and scale that's fast enough to absorb the 700 graduates who are coming into the job market looking for work. And therefore, we need now more than ever before an African Development Bank that is focused on getting things done, creating jobs, both benefiting from our traditional sectors like agriculture, but even more exciting, the creative industries such as film and art and song, for which you can generate significant amount of jobs than we currently at the moment.
Now, what's your vision to transform AfDB, to make it that global main development partner in the continent?
My vision for the African Development Bank is threefold. First of all, we must make sure that it is acting and behaving like the premier development institution that Africa needs. That means investing in speed, in effectiveness, in good outcomes. It means partnering with all of the African financial institutions on the continent. This is not a job for one institution. And importantly, we're making sure that our staff within the institution have the ability, the resources to be the best of who they can be. Secondly, it means working and supporting with governments. They're tired of being lectured to. They know what needs to be done. What they need help with is dealing with some of the consequential challenges of our time: debt, climate, and creating enough jobs, as you rightly pointed out. And in dealing with these two, the third pillar of my vision is focusing on investing in agriculture, as I mentioned, creative industries, but making sure we are creating enough markets through trade. It's unacceptable today that Africa only trades less than 15% with ourselves. It's unacceptable today that even though we've got 60% of the arable land on the continent, we only produce 15% of what we consume. The real implication of that is that every single time we import from outside the continent, we're exporting the very capital we need here in Africa, investing in infrastructure, in energy, in creating jobs, and making sure we're growing the economy to create the jobs that you talked about when we started.
The IMF is arguably one of the biggest lending partners for Africa, but many have criticized their conditionalities and how difficult it is to access some of their facilities. How can the AfDB bridge that gap when it comes to ensuring that the continent gets reliable funding?
One of the challenges we find in the development space is that oftentimes we talk about these relationships when countries are struggling. And therefore, there is a sense of urgency, and the prescriptions of how to treat a patient who is critically ill becomes an issue in and of themselves. What I would like to do with the African Development Bank is to make sure that we're not talking about the patient when they're critically ill. We need to talk about the patient long before they get to the hospital. We need to be talking about how do we invest in a growth strategy so that we finally break this cycle of aid and debt and aid and debt to one that is about growth and prosperity and transformation. It can be done. The only challenge we've had is that we have not had a proper accounting of the resources that we have on the continent. We haven't really invested in the fact that the median age on the continent is only 19. And when it comes to resources, oftentimes we go to the World Bank, we go to the IMF, without doing enough of what is already here on the continent. To give you a simple example, we've got pension funds that sit on $250 billion in resources that we could tap into. We've got African financial institutions collectively that have more than $70 billion on their balance sheet. The missing link is that we're not working collectively together and treating this as one balance sheet for one continent and developing a more ambitious agenda for our continent. The truth is that these solutions are hidden in plain sight. They're the same things that worked after World War II in Europe. They're the same things that worked in China, in India, in other economies that have seen this transformational growth. It's time for us to accept that Africa has more than enough plans, more than enough strategies. We have more conferences than any other place that I see of. We need to focus on the day after. We need to focus on one layer below, the plumbing of development. It takes hard work, it takes investment, it takes years. When you talk about unemployment, for example, this is a lifelong commitment. It starts with the quality of our education systems, the health that we invest in our children. It includes the technical vocation programs. We need the private sector involved, and we must have the patience as a people to build those foundations that every economy across the world has built in. In fact, if you'll allow me, my dream is for politicians across the continent to say certain things are off the political debate. We should not be debating education or health or social protection programs or disaster risk insurance. Those are foundational. I have no problems competing on the quality of the pillars or colors of a house. We can compete on the quality of services, but not the foundational stuff. And that's where I would like to take the African Development Bank. All those areas where we're not looking for glory, we're just building as strong a foundation as we possibly can for our children and our grandchildren.
You say some of the key challenges the continent face are hidden in plain sight, but really, can Africa be debt-free?
Absolutely. I have no doubt about that. And partly because oftentimes when we talk about debt, we only talk about debt as a singular source of financing for everything else. I studied finance, and the reason I love finance is that it reminds me of chemistry. If you combine your debt, your equity, your natural assets, then you begin to see your financial condition differently. You begin to distinguish what is really a solvency problem from a liquidity problem. But at the same time, any accountant would tell you debt is only one side of the balance sheet. We don't spend enough time on growth. To give you a simple example, if we are trading only 15% amongst ourselves, if we simply increased that to say 30%, 40%, all of a sudden we are giving each other capital to invest. We're beginning to grow our economy. If we're a $1 trillion economy with as limited energy as we currently have, imagine what we do when we double that sources of energy. But it's detail. It's the type of things that in development people are unwilling to spend time on. To give you another example, we've got state-owned enterprises that have provided services, whether it's water or electricity. $1 billion hasn't been collected. And this is not because people aren't willing to pay. It's because we haven't taken the time to make it easy for people to pay, to invest in basic technology to collect that revenue. We are losing as a continent $90 billion to illicit financial flows. We need collectively as a people to talk about the level of debt on our balance sheets alongside other sources of finance. Understand as a government that individually, no single government has enough resources to finance development. We've got to bring in the private sector. We've got to make it easier for them to develop. And far too often, we spend so much time creating tax incentives and facilities for foreign investors to come into our countries without dedicating as much time to make sure that our domestic enterprises are enjoying the same facilities, the same tax breaks that they need. They're not going anywhere. They're going to stay here. They might expand to the neighboring countries, but we need to double down on the domestic private sector so that we can clear the stock of debt we have that is inhibiting our ability to pay for education, to pay for health. But mark my words, debt isn't supposed to go away, right? Debt is an instrument for growth. Every company does that. There is a healthy amount of debt, but the bigger issue is, how do you invest it? Are we investing it in a way that generates revenues? And that's what the African Development Bank should be. It should be the facilitator in chief, the syndication vehicle in chief, so that every single sector, we are providing enough seed funding, enough knowledge, enough capacity for economies to grow, but immediately partnering with the private sector.
You make mention of providing seed funding, and I'm quite interested in that because one of the biggest challenges that entrepreneurs face in Africa is getting capital for their businesses. Collaterals are often outrageous and they find it difficult accessing funds. How do you plan to bridge that gap should you be given the nod?
So one of the things about finance is that oftentimes we have capital in the same country, in the same space as we have ideas, but they're mismatched. We have proposals going to banks that should be going to investment houses. We have proposals going to investment houses that should be going to microfinance institutions. My role at the African Development Bank is to make sure that we are using the full range of our institutions, our balance sheets. We are not shy about partnering with the African Import-Export Bank, TDB, ATI, there are 16 of them. And making sure that when an enterprise comes to any one of us looking for financing, we are comfortable directing them to a partner right across the street. And the same applies within country. And you're absolutely right. Sometimes we run our entrepreneurs through circles and through cumbersome process. No entrepreneur has 18 months to wait for a project approval, right? It is much better to tell them upfront, very early, I cannot help you, but I know someone who else who can. And if everyone is doing that, we are clearing that market much faster, much better. And importantly, in this important question you raised, making sure that young people have a seat at the table, that women who make far better business decisions than most men I know have a seat at the table. And importantly, for a continent that is sadly also plagued by strife, we're making sure we're taking investment to conflict-affected countries and regions because nothing guarantees long-term peace than investing in the private sector.
Thank you so much. I wish you all the best in your decision to run for the ADB leadership. I'm hoping that you actually win. If you do, then we can see all these ideas come to bear. Well, that's how we wrap up the bulletin here on News 6. I've been speaking to Samuel, Dr. Samuel Mumbai. He is a candidate for the African Development Bank presidency, and we've just been discussing some of the key policies he plans to implement should he be given the nod. And